Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Sinatra. I'm the director of the Centre de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur les Humanités Numériques. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Jada Watson today from Ottawa for a talk. Jada is an adjunct professor in music information studies and digital humanities at the University of Ottawa. She's also the principal investigator of the SSHRC-funded Song Data Project. Research focuses on the role of market data and data-driven systems in the formation and evolution of genre categories. And a current project explores how systems within the market data regime reinforce the white supremacist capitalist patriarchal values in the country music industry. She has published a series of public studies on representation in the country music industry, including a report in partnership with CMT's Equal Play campaign. Her work has been cited in a legal brief submitted to the US Federal Communications Commission in response to the National Association of Broadcasters' proposal for further deregulation, as well as in the Grammy Recording Academy's report on inclusion and diversity. She is a co-editor of a forthcoming collection of essays entitled Whose Country Music? Genre, Identity, and Belonging in a 21st Century Country Music with Cambridge University Press. So welcome, Jada, and pleasure listening to your talk this morning.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here virtually and hope in the future I can be there physically. And so what I'm going to speak about today is just a small part of a larger book project that I'm working on. And I'll just share. Michael, you'll let me know if this works.
Yes, perfect.
All good? Okay, perfect. So I'd like to begin actually by offering gratitude to the lands and the Indigenous ancestors who have inhabited these lands for centuries. I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Ontario in Canada, which is unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, who are the traditional guardians of this land. I recognize that the educational and research enterprises in which I participate occur on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, and I endeavor to ensure that my activities honor and respect First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their lands. All right, so today's talk is Silencing the Past, Industry Data and the Production of Institutional Memory. In September 2007, Reese Palmer's debut single, Country Girl, entered Billboard's Hot Country Songs chart. Radio was slow to embrace a single, which peaked at 54 and exited the chart after just 7 weeks. With Country Girl, Palmer became the first Black female solo artist to chart in 20 years, since Donna Mason's Green Eyes, Crying Those Blue Tears, and Nisha Jackson's Alive and Well charted in 1987. Before them, 9 songs by Ruby Falls, 1 by the Pointer Sisters, and 3 by Linda Martell charted in the 1970s. Palmer charted 2 more songs in 2008, and only Mickey Guyton's Why Baby Why has charted afterwards. Songs by these women have had short life cycles on the longest running Billboard chart, leaving behind a faint data trail marking their time in the industry's mainstream. Except for Martell, Palmer, and Guyton, whose careers have received increasing media and scholarly attention, the stories of these other women have been left out of country music discourse and remain unknown to country music fans. Without chart-topping hits, their careers received limited, if any, attention from the press. Their music was not widely distributed, and as a result, their contributions have not been recognized by the industry's institutions. They don't even have entries in the Country Music Hall of Fame's Encyclopedia of Country Music, which is now in its 2nd edition. In an industry tightly centered around documenting, preserving, and promoting its heritage, these women, rendered invisible by the industrial system, have been largely expunged from country music's institutional memory. Billboard chart data plays a critical role in capturing institutional memory, but they should also be seen as a tool for directing and shaping it. As I've argued elsewhere, Billboard charts function as a curatorial instrument that systematically remembers some artists while casting away or forgetting others. My previous work, focusing on hot country songs between 1996 and 2016, considered how changes in chart methodology resulted in the declining presence of female artists in country music's commercial culture, declining from a high of 33% of the charts in 1999 to just 12.8% by 2016. And I should point out that 33% was a historic high. for female artists in country music, as a forthcoming article will reveal. But disappearance can only be traced if artists appear in the chart data in the first place. What happens if they never really chart in a manner that is detectable, traceable, or reproducible within the industry's business model? What if they never chart at all? How does the absence of a group or groups of artists influence decision-making? Treating chart data as part of the industrial system, as a tool that instructs, directs, and by extension restricts artists, allows us to understand how weak data trails that are short, trails that peak in the bottom of the chart, trails that are few in number, are used to justify excluding Black and of-color artists in general, and women specifically, from participation. In this way, chart data becomes integral part of the business process, integral part of the process that secures the industry's white racial narrative dictating who belongs in country music. So this talk today shares some results of a data-driven analysis of Billboard's Hot Country Songs chart to consider the ways in which chart data serves to dictate and reinforce industry practices. I take as my starting point 1958, a point that aligns with the regularization of Billboard's weekly charts, the establishment of the Nashville industry system, and the formation of the Country Music Association, and includes every song that charted between 1958 and 2016. So I'm covering a near 60-year period of industry history. This data was augmented manually to include the biographic details of the artists responsible for these songs, to enable analysis of the artists that have contributed to the development of country music culture. To be able to consider the impact of chart data on the cultural identity of the genre, I'm also bringing into this discussion data sets that capture award history of the Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Music, as well as inductions of the Country Music Hall of Fame. These recognition systems, charts, awards, and inductions, are deeply interconnected. Charts might provide an indicator of industry trends, but awards and inductions, both of which rely to varying degrees on charts as a marker for contention, codify the past and direct the future. I'm interested here in tracing data through recognition systems in the industry, considering how their repetition constantly reaffirms racial boundaries inscribed in industry structures. Taken together, these data sets offer an opportunity to reflect on how data dictates industry practices, obscuring and even erasing contributions of Black and of-color artists. Patricia Hill Collins's concept of the matrix of domination is particularly instructive to understanding how a Southern white male thesis pervades country music discourse. Collins's matrix consists of 4 interlocking domains that explain how social or industrial systems are configured, are administered, and become ingrained in organizational practice, and are ultimately experienced by individuals. These structural, disciplinary, and interpersonal domains are connected through media and culture, which is the hegemonic domain, which circulates ideas, ideologies, and normalizes rhetoric by perpetuating established narratives and undermining the seriousness of discrimination embedded in its structures. Reconfiguring our conception of the country music industry through this matrix frames business decisions in relationship to its structural configuration, allowing for a deeper understanding of how structural decisions made in the 1920s, which I'll discuss in a moment, have been upheld and maintained through everyday practices in the industry, and also how they are reinforced through discourse and recognition systems. One of the ways in which we can begin to understand how the industry matrix works is through data, a regime deeply embedded in each domain. The country music industry relies on various forms of data to make business decisions, from artist development to eligibility for opportunities and awards, and to evaluate risk and return on investment before signing new artists. In this way, data in the form of sales, radio airplay, charts, streams, and even social media engagement, and now I'd say TikTok, data repeated within and between each domain becomes part of practice, discourse, and culture. The concept of repetition is at the center of how this data regime operates within the industrial matrix. Sarah Ahmed defines the relationality of repetitive practices through the example of academic citation. Through the development of a scholarly body of literature, she writes, white men cite and teach the works of other white men, a form of repetition that legitimizes and solidifies a patriarchal system. As these repetitive practices build up and legitimize white men, they also serve to marginalize, delegitimize, and reject others. Within the country music industry, we can trace repetition through this data, through the chart and other recognition systems in the industry, and we can learn through it how repetition reaffirms structures, reinforcing the sound and image of the white male prototype. Non-prototypical artists within this system, so those who are not prioritized, experience varying degrees of what Valerie Purdy-Vons and Richard Ibach term intersectional invisibility, which is defined as the systemic failure of individuals with intersecting identities to be recognized as members of a community. Because race has historically been associated with Black men and gender with white women, Black women are relegated to a position of acute social invisibility in most social and cultural systems, an issue that pervades country music culture. So bringing these two concepts together offers a framework for examining how the codes and conventions embedded within the industry structures are repeated through the industrial matrix, impacting charts, awards, and inductions, and ultimately contributing to the reinforcement of whiteness and erasure of Black and of color artists from country music culture. The popular music industry developed in the 1920s along a musical color line that echoed Jim Crow segregation. Even though Black and white musicians played and listened to the same music, when record executives developed marketing strategies for records in the 1920s, they created two categories, hillbilly music and race music, through which they would market music to white and Black communities, respectively. While these specific marketing categories are no longer used today, they were replaced with country and R&B or soul by the 1950s. The racial segregation established in the 1920s was institutionalized through the development of systems of production, so labels and publishers, systems of distribution, radio formats, magazines and media, digital service providers, systems of recognition, such as popularity charts and awards, and of course, canonization, so halls of fame, museums, and encyclopedias. These labels have also been integrated into the metadata structures used to physically separate albums in record stores, to categorize music in mail-order record club pamphlets, and in music magazines, as in Billboard, and even define the algorithms that underpin recommender systems of the digital service providers that we use every day, each reinforcing the musical color line inscribed in the industry in the 1920s. These systems are deeply interconnected, networked around a business model that responds not to audience interest, but to data generated from these very systems. The data resulting from their actions then influence how labels sign, promote, and support artists, feeding back into the system from which they emerged. The country music industry grew out of these racially segregated structures that formed in the 1920s, centralizing in Nashville, Tennessee in the 1950s through the development of a network of recording studios, record labels, and publishing houses, and deeply connected to commercial radio. As Travis Steimeling reveals through first-person accounts in his new book, Nashville Cats, labels in Nashville reinforce segregation of the broader industry's racialized marketing strategies by recording Black artists on gospel and R&B records, but refusing to record their country offerings. Although Black, Hispanic, and Latinx artists often resisted country's exclusionary practices, Charles Hughes and Amanda Martinez have revealed the ways in which the industry disregarded country music's multiracial and multi-ethnic roots and instead promoted a white racial narrative. These early actions played a critical role in maintaining the white racial framing that pervades public discourse in the industry today. Deeply connected to these structural issues are other forms of oppression: sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, and ableism that have likewise been embedded in the industry structures since the early days of the recording industry. The country music industry has long perpetuated a form of gender-based programming that has relegated white women to a secondary position in the industry while excluding Black and of color women almost entirely. Within this oppressive system, LGBTQIA+ artists are strikingly absent and have historically been forced to hide their gender identity and sexuality to participate in the industry. So these interlocking forms of oppression have not just impacted the lives and careers of artists, but they've also reinforced the white supremacist structures on which the industry was built. So now we're going to turn to the data. Chart data offers us an opportunity here to evaluate the results of these industrial systems. Billboard's Hot Country Songs chart, the longest running country chart, dates back to 1944. But we're going to focus on a 60-year period from 1958 to 2016. Again, a point in history of the industry that aligns with the regularization of a weekly chart system, the establishment of the Nashville label system, and the formation of the Country Music Association. The data set for use for this study consists of the 18,576 songs that debuted on the chart between January 1st, 1958 and the 31st of December, 2016, and includes each song's debut and peak position and date, as well as the number of weeks on chart. The data set was augmented with attributes describing the ensemble type, race and ethnicity, and gender of the artists' collaborations or ensembles. It's imperative to recognize from the outset that combining artists that are not white or Black together in one category is not ideal. Using one term to draw together artists of several races and ethnicities might be read as an attempt to reinforce a racial hierarchy of importance by positioning white and Black artists as a standard and biracial, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latinx, and Asian Americans as an exception. Rather, this decision was taken in order to ensure consistent analysis of the data and comparability with other studies of Billboard charts. It also ensures that these artists are visible, that their songs are visible in the graphics. Over the course of this 60-year period, regardless of how the data are examined, white male artists dominate the charts. The graph on this slide summarizes representation by both race and ethnicity and gender, and we're looking at the unique artists. 94.9% of the artists that have had songs debut on the chart over this period have been white artists, while just 5.1% are Black, Indigenous artists of color or multiracial ensembles and collaborations. BIPOC women are the most marginalized group within this industry, with just 0.5% of the artists in the data set. The percentage of songs by white artists remains relatively unchanged when shifting to look at the representation of artists responsible for each of the 18,576 songs. This perspective shows us that white male artists are responsible for 67% of the charting songs, and just 6% are by white male-female collaborations. So we're seeing those numbers shift here a little bit. And while this might seem like a significant change from representation of unique artists, because we're seeing that white men, representation of songs by white men has increased, and by white male-female collaborations has decreased, we have to remember that 14.2% of those male-female ensembles were special collaborations that produced just one or a very small number of charting songs. This disparity is thrown into greater relief through a line graph that maps the distribution of these songs over the course of a near 60-year period. Parsing this data by gender of the artists offers a greater perspective on the distribution of songs by race and ethnicity of artists over the 60-year period. This graphic reveals both the dominance of white artists, but also the privileging of white male artists in this space, who average 68% of the songs over this period. White women, who come in second to white men, average 21% of the charting songs, peaking at 33% in 1999, as I indicated earlier. What remains most striking here is not only the overwhelming whiteness of the chart, but the time periods in which Black and of color artists emerge, the 1970s and in the last 10 years. It's critical to note that these are both periods in which the chart was generated through a hybrid chart methodology that included audience consumption. A racial hierarchy emerges through this animated graph of songs of white, Black, and artists of color and multiracial ensembles that shows solo Black artists are the most marginalized within this space, especially Black women. Examining the frequency of songs by their peak position, and this is one of my favorite graphs. I think that it's it's even more telling than ones that we're looking at now, throws into stark relief the racial inequities within the industry, as it shows us where within the weekly rankings songs by Black, artists of color, and multi-ethnic ensembles peak. For both Black and artists of color, 67% of their songs peak outside of the top 10. Perhaps most startlingly, the 102 songs peaked in the top 10 are by just 6 men, 19.6% of which are by Johnny Rodriguez, and 50% of which are by Charlie Pride. More critically, a Black or of color female artist has yet to crack the top 10 in the industry charts. Linda Martell's Color Him Father remains the highest charting song by a Black female artist, reaching number 22 in 1969. And Ojibwe artist from Canada, Crystal Shawanda's You Can Let Go is the highest ranking song by a woman of color at number 19 in 2008. Chart data plays a significant role within the industry's matrix, impacting systems of recognition and used as determinants for opportunities in the industry. Rooted in the concept of excellence, awards and honors in the industry are bound within a framework that promotes a set of criteria with merit in mind. The Country Music Association and Academy of Country Music began awarding prizes in the late 1960s and have historically used chart data to determine eligibility. In the 50 awarding years that align with the study period, just 2% of the nominations for artist-centered awards, so I'm thinking here of artist, entertainer or artist of the year, female artist, male artist, new male, new female, and new artist. So all of these categories that are just centered around the artist. So just 2% of the nominations for those artist-centered awards were for Black or of color artists, and just 2 Black men and 3 of color men have won, compared to the 219 wins for white artists. Even as the data points used to determine eligibility has expanded to include other metrics, the historic exclusion of BIPOC artists within the industry has meant that their careers cannot be weighted in comparison to the white men and women whose data trails have resulted in access to opportunities in the industry. These issues ultimately impact the induction processes for the Country Music Hall of Fame and are of critical concern for the role that this institution plays in upholding and cementing of the white racial framing of the country music story. Of the 142 inductions to date, just 7 are Black Indigenous artists of color, 2 of whom are Black men inducted after 2000. And I should note that this doesn't actually include Ray Charles, who was inducted into 2022, and he will be inducted in April. Billboard charts relay critical information about the shape and evolving identity of a musical genre, but they also tell us something about how that industry functions, how groups of artists are privileged or disadvantaged within a genre's institutional practices. The results of country music's longest-running industry chart reveal a racial and gendered hierarchy within the industry. While not altogether surprising for anyone that follows country music closely, the depth to which they persist in the 21st century is a sign of the deep embeddedness of white supremacy within the industry structures. What emerges through this industry data is a deep form of cultural redlining that relegates the music of Black and of color artists, especially women, to the margins of the industry. While the concept of redlining has historically been used to understand how customers have been denied policies based on race and ethnicity, Sophia Moja-Noble draws on this concept to explain how technology and algorithms directly or indirectly use criteria like race, ethnicity, and gender to make decisions, assessments, and recommendations. What's critical to understand is that the data underlying the chart, awards, and induction processes are human-made. They are the results of practices in the industry, not of an audience or market response to music. Redlining is most visible in the country music industry in the ranking of songs by their peak positions, what I like to think of as a kind of geography of the chart history that draws a deep line around the space that Black and of color artists occupy. Their songs reside largely within the bottom positions of the chart, charting for an average of 8 weeks. Being redlined in this manner means not just that the artists responsible for these songs were more likely to be passed over for industry opportunities or dropped by labels for inactivity, but that their failure to succeed is used to deny access to future artists, blaming artists, not the system. The Hot Country Songs chart plays a critical role in promoting a deficit narrative for Black and of color artists within the industry that serves white racial interests. Rather than seeing their absence in the chart as indicative of a systemic problem, the industry, so labels, radio, and publishers, use the lack of data to justify and maintain institutional practices that reject Black and of color artists. These restrictive practices have allowed only a few Black and of color artists to succeed. Not only has this not reduced the overall racial gap, but it allows these few artists to accumulate accolades, while at the same time allowing the industry to blame inequities on the Black and of color artists who have not succeeded in an uneven playing field. Echoing law scholar Dorothy A. Brown, this leads white industry professionals to think that if one Black or of color artist can make it, they all can. Quote, failure lies not in the system, but in the individual, end quote. Industry policy and collective prejudice then have worked together to maintain what George Lipsitz terms possessive investment of whiteness, that is responsible for the racialized hierarchies that persist within country music. For the industry, whiteness has what he calls a cash value, accounting for the advantages that come to white artists and businesses who profit from discriminatory practices and from inherited criteria that pass on the spoils of discrimination to succeeding generations. The business model becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It encourages investment in whiteness because whiteness has historically provided financial advantages. What emerges through this industry data then is a deep form of cultural redlining that relegates the music of Black and of color artists, as I've said earlier, to the margins. So having a weak data trail for these artists means not just that artists responsible for these songs were more likely to be passed over for industry opportunities or dropped by labels for inactivity, but that their failure to succeed will be used to deny access to others. The Country Music Association, the Country Music Association played a central role in building the industry's business model. The chief architect responsible for rebranding the image of country music in the 1960s, while at the same time building up a business centered around radio charts. While the Country Music Association worked to modernize country music's identity through country format radio, they also began developing a historical definition of the genre through the Country Music Foundation via the Hall of Fame and Museum and the Country Music Foundation Library and Media Center in 1961. They also established the CMA's award ceremony, held for the first time in 1967. Through these initiatives, the CMA formalized educational and cultural initiatives that allowed them to consciously construct a narrative narrowly defined by class and race. By the end of the 1960s, the CMA had positioned itself at the center of the industry, actively building up radio format while at the same time constructing and maintaining the industry's historic legacy through events, museums, awards, and the Hall of Fame. And it's the Hall of Fame that I want to talk about now. So the data regime that we've been looking at throughout this talk today plays a critical role in all of these processes. As we've already seen, the regime significantly shaped award history, but they've likewise played a critical role in shaping cultural heritage practices within the Country Music Foundation and the Hall of Fame and Museum. While conducting interviews for a book project, one Black female solo artist shared with me that when she moved to Nashville in the 1990s, she visited the Foundation archives and asked the curator for all of the materials they had on Black artists. The curator returned with one envelope with a headshot of Ruby Falls. While the archives have evolved since this artist first moved to Nashville, preliminary research suggests that they hold limited artifacts capturing the careers of Black, Indigenous, and country musicians of color. The data emerging from systems of production, then, do not just impact systems of recognition, but also the systems of institutionalization and the making of archives. In this way, the process that emerges here is akin to what Michel Roth-Truot describes as silences that enter the processes of historical production through the making of sources, the making of archives, the making of narratives, and the making of history. Records of Black artist careers were not collected at their moment of production, unlike those of the white men and women in the industry. Data is destiny, as Joy Buolamwini stated in her work on algorithms. The industry relies on past market data to make contemporary business decisions. They are now built into the technology that underpins the industry's market, from SoundScan technology in the 1990s to the algorithms that run charts, radio programming databases, and digital service providers today. This is an inherited system, and the past dwells within the matrix. Repetition is integral to the inner workings of the country industry's model. The data generated within and by each domain of the matrix is then used to make business decisions. In short, data is repeated from one domain of the industry to the next, becoming a regime through which decisions are made, practices are regulated, and cultures are defined. The white patriarchal industry has, to borrow from Sarah Ahmed, inherited decisions that make exclusions for them, without them, decisions that mark edges, marking out where they do not have to go. But just as the system depends on repetition, it also relies on erasure, on forgetting. If songs by white artists are played more on the radio, they have greater access to charts, entering in greater numbers, climbing higher, and accumulating more value, both financial and cultural capital, positioning them in contention for awards and, over time, inductions to the Hall of Fame. But their domination of chart and industry culture is secured by the removal of traces of the Black and of color artists who were there before. Removal, as Ahmed states, can also be inherited. Nowhere is this inheritance more visible than in the stories of Black women, of Linda Martell, the Pointer Sisters, Ruby Falls, Nisha Jackson, Donna Mason, Reese Palmer, and Mickey Guyton, whose stories have left faint data trails on the chart, or of the numerous Black women whose songs didn't make it to the charts to begin with. Through this double process of accumulation and removal embedded in the industrial matrix, the industry maintains and upholds white supremacist patriarchal narrative, cementing, as Ahmed says, mechanisms that ensure the persistence of that structure, holding on to, investing in, and reproducing inheritance. Thank you.
Jada, that was wonderful. Seeing you back on the big screen. So I'll just give everybody like a few minutes to sort of take into your talk and ask questions, and so I'll take my